Congressman Jamie Raskin is the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, served on the January 6th Select Committee, is a constitutional law professor, and joins me now. What is your reaction to the indictment, first of all? The three referrals mirrored yours, but are you disappointed at all that they didn't include the fourth referral, which was incitement for the riot?
No, the indictment overall is a very powerful vindication of the rule of law in American democracy. And the one charge that the special counsel has that we didn't have strikes me as extremely compelling, which is conspiracy to violate the civil rights of the people, specifically the right to vote. And it rang a bell in my mind immediately from what Abraham Lincoln said about insurrection, which he said was an assault on the first principle of government, which is the right of the people to choose their own elected officials. So I was very pleased with it. I can understand why they shied away from the count that we recommended about aiding and abetting insurrection and giving aid and comfort to insurrectionists. This statute has not been tried very much. Of course, no president certainly has ever put the people of the United States through what Donald Trump put us through. But I think that the special counsel avoided a whole conversation about the First Amendment and how far you can go in inciting insurrection and giving aid and comfort. We felt that it was clear that Trump had done so when he called them great patriots in his tweet and told them to remember this day forever. And he inflamed them by saying that Mike Pence didn't have the courage that needed to be to do what needed to be done. But I think that he avoided a legitimate First Amendment controversy there. Now, of course, Trump supporters are going to claim that everything that Trump was doing was just free speech, which is silly because he's being charged with a whole series of actions of conduct that ended up amounting to a conspiracy to obstruct a federal proceeding, that amounted to a conspiracy to defraud the American people of the real election, superimposing counterfeit electors over the electors who were chosen according to federal and state law.
From your deep familiarity with this case and with everything that happened, do you have a sense of who the sixth currently unnamed co-conspirator might be? He's referred to as a political consultant in the indictment.
Some different names, went through my head when I read that one. I suppose, I shouldn't speculate at this point about who that might be. There were clearly people who were egging the president on, but the key point to my mind is the president was the initiating and motivating actor in all of these events. The right-wing groups who wanted to protest Biden's victory and ascent to power got permits to protest on January the 20th, when Biden was going to be sworn in. And it was Donald Trump who got them to move the permits from the 20th to January 6th, saying, no, this isn't over, and trying to bring all of the attention to Washington at the point of the peaceful transfer of power, saying, be there, we'll be wild. And no president had ever done anything remotely like that in the history of the United States, trying to interfere with the handover of the reins of power. And of course, Biden had defeated Trump by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, which was a margin that Trump had declared an absolute landslide when he happened to have beaten Hillary Clinton by the same numbers.
The indictment says that Trump deliberately disregarded the truth, because he obviously could have a defense saying, well, I thought I did win. But it says he deliberately disregarded the truth. It lists so many people, top cabinet officials and others, who told him so. We also heard testimony to your committee, of course, supporting that. Let's play some of that.
So we're in the Oval and there's a discussion going on. And the president says, yeah, we lost. We need to let that issue go to the next guy, meaning President Biden.
I remember maybe a week after the election was called, I popped into the Oval just to like give the president the headlines and see how he was doing. And he was looking at the TV and he said, "Can you believe I lost to this effing guy?"
And I said, like, does the president really think that he lost? And he said, you know, a lot of times he'll tell me that he lost, but he wants to keep fighting it. And he thinks that there might be enough to overturn the election, but, you know, he pretty much has acknowledged that he's lost. So he had said something to the effect of, "I don't want people to know we lost, Mark. This is embarrassing. Figure it out. We need to figure it out. I don't want people to know that we lost."
Well, it wasn't just them. The White House counsel repeatedly told Trump that he had lost. The Attorney General of the United States, William Barr, who was as loyal sycophant as you could find in the Trump administration, told Trump he had lost and said that all of the verbiage that Trump was engaged in was based on BS. So he was surrounded by people telling him that he lost, in addition to him, you know, saying things like, "Can you believe I lost to this guy?" In any event, even if he really believed that he hadn't lost, and there's no way he could have believed that, but if he really believed that, you still don't have the authority you don't have a right to try to overthrow the election and to interfere with the federal proceeding and to stage counterfeit votes. I mean, somebody might really believe he or she has the right to vote if they're 15 years old or if they're not a citizen in the country or whatever. But if they go to vote and to try to alter the outcome of the election by one vote, they're going to go to jail if they're convicted of that after the presumption of innocence and due process operate. How much more guilty are you if you try to steal the entire election, whether or not you knew that you had lost it? Now, of course, 60 federal and state courts had rejected every claim of electoral fraud and corruption that Donald Trump had brought. So it's clear that he understood it. But in any event, the way we settle these things is by going to court. It's not by staging insurrections and political coups against the normal electoral process.